With Ukraine, for months now, leaders of the West, the United States and Russia have been embroiled in a war of words with threats, counter-threats, provocations and diplomacy over Ukraine. While fears of a possible Russian invasion have been mounting, with the West and the United States in particular raising the alarm, Moscow claims it is withdrawing some of its troops from the country's border with Ukraine. The Russian Defense Ministry says some units are returning to their bases, and earlier today, Russia also announced it has ended its military drills in Crimea, and that its soldiers there were returning to their garrisons. Russia's state television broadcast images of military units crossing a bridge linking the Russian-controlled peninsula of Crimea to the mainland. Moscow did not say how many units were pulling back. The deployment of some 130,000 Russian troops to the north, east and south of Ukraine has triggered alarms in Western capitals, fearful that a military operation could be imminent. And international powers are reacting cautiously to Russia's recent claims of a de-escalation in the tensions. The United States and its NATO allies remain unimpressed and unconvinced. NATO's Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg saying within the last hour that in fact Russian mobilization is still building on the border, not de-escalating. In a speech last night, US President Joe Biden said danger is still clear and present.
Reported today that some military units are leaving their positions near Ukraine. That would be good, but we have not yet verified that. We have not yet verified the Russian military units are returning to their home bases. Indeed, our analysts indicate that they remain very much in a threatening position. And the fact remains, right now, Russia has more than 150,000 troops encircling Ukraine and Belarus and along Ukraine's border.
President Biden appealed to Russian President Vladimir Putin to step back from waging war on Ukraine, saying it would cause needless death and destruction. Biden added that a Russian invasion is still very much a possibility, but he said there is room for more diplomacy.
The United States is prepared no matter what happens. We are ready with diplomacy to be engaged in diplomacy with Russia and our allies and partners to improve stability and security in Europe as a whole. And we are ready to respond decisively to Russian attack on Ukraine, which is still very much a possibility. Yesterday, the Russian government publicly proposed to continue the diplomacy. I agree. We should give the diplomacy every chance to succeed.
NATO defense ministers are holding a crucial meeting in Brussels where NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has said he wants to see stronger signals of rapprochement.
NATO defense ministers will meet today and tomorrow, facing critical challenges for European security, and we have heard the signs from Moscow about readiness to continue diplomatic efforts. Okay. But so far we have not seen any de-escalation on the ground. On the contrary, it appears that Russia continues the military buildup.
Ukraine is a sovereign country. It is making its own choices about its own future. But the Kremlin doesn't like this. And so it threatens war. And this is the essence of the current escalation. This is something we simply cannot accept. I think diplomacy has not yet spoken its last words, and we saw signs of hope yesterday. But now deeds have to follow those words.
What we haven't seen is evidence of withdrawal that has been claimed by the Kremlin. In fact, we've seen continued build-up of things like field hospitals and strategic weapon systems such as Iskander missiles deployed. So I think the reality, as I said last week when I visited Moscow, is that we'll take Russia at its word, but we'll judge them on their actions.
So lots going on today, and for the very latest, let's cross live to WION's Rosie Burchard, who joins us from Brussels. And Rosie, with Jens Stoltenberg and others in NATO saying that they don't see a de-escalation on the ground by the Russians, despite the Kremlin's claims. What is the mood there? Are people increasingly anxious about where this is going to head?
The mood in Brussels is tense, and there certainly was a degree of scepticism on the way into this meeting. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said he had heard these overtures from Russia suggesting dialogue could continue, and he'd also heard this Russian announcement that troops may be moved back from near the border with Ukraine. But he said, as you mentioned, there was no sign, according to NATO, no sign of a concrete de-escalation on the ground. In fact, to the contrary, it looks like, according to NATO, that military build-up continues. However, he did also want to highlight that NATO remains ready for dialogue. He reiterated that NATO has sent Russia proposals back in January on areas that NATO thinks Russia and the alliance could better cooperate, or where they might be able to try and find some common ground. So, for example, greater coordination on arms control, or briefing each other on military exercises. There have been, according to NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg, no reply from Moscow yet on that. But still, with both sides saying they're open to dialogue, it seems that so far, despite these really flaming tensions, that diplomatic path, those diplomatic talks, have not yet run dry.
And Rosie, there's been a substantial cyber assault on Ukraine over the course of the last few hours, targeting major government departments, including the Defence Ministry in Kiev. The Russians have denied having anything to do with it. But does NATO view that cyber assault in and of itself as part of Russia's escalation that they're talking about?
Well, Simon, we haven't heard specifically on NATO about this yet. That's something we'll be listening out for very closely throughout the day. That may be, we can imagine that is coming up in these talks between ministers. But we know that NATO has in the past condemned cyber attacks, and certainly in off-the-record briefings that I've been to, I've heard from both the European Union and NATO side that they are monitoring and preparing for types of aggression which might be beyond a simple, or might be beyond an invasion on the ground. So something that NATO and, of course, us as journalists here in Brussels are monitoring very carefully.
And of course, the US has warned that a cyber assault could be part of the kind of hybrid warfare they are claiming that Russia may wage on Ukraine. That's WION's Rosie Burchard live for us in Brussels today. Thanks very much indeed for that, Rosie.